What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Archill Podcast. I'm Archill. Actually, no, um, I'm not Archill. I'm AI clone of Archill, and you are watching the first ever AI generated Archill podcast, which we will call AI Chill Podcast. Every guest you'll see on this show will be AI generated, just like me. And now, without farther ado, let's get started. Today I'm joined with the legendary founder of Y Combinator, the myth, the man, the legend, the one and only Mr. Paul Graham. Hi, Paul. How you doing?
Hey, Archill. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. Actually, I'm a big fan of Archill Podcast. So everyone, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about this YouTube channel. I can't wait to see our episode live.
Thanks, Paul. Let's directly dive into our conversation. Let me ask the very first question. How to get startup ideas.
Well, the way to get startup ideas is not to try to think of startup ideas. It's to look for problems, preferably problems you have yourself. The very best startup ideas tend to have three things in common. There's something the founders themselves want, that they themselves can build, and that few others realize are worth doing. Microsoft, Apple, Yahoo, Google, and Facebook all began this way.
That's quite insightful, But now let's get deeper into our conversation and talk about problems. Why is it so important to work on a problem you yourself have?
Among other things, it ensures the problem really exists. It sounds obvious to say you should only work on problems that exist. And yet, by far, the most common mistake startups make is to solve problems no one has. I made it myself. In 1995, I started a company to put art galleries online. But galleries didn't want to be online. It's not how the art business works. So, why did I spend 6 months working on this stupid idea? Because I didn't pay attention to users. I invented a model of the world that didn't correspond to reality and worked from that. I didn't notice my model was wrong. Even then, I took embarrassingly long to catch on. I was attached to my model of the world and I'd spent a lot of time on the software. They had to want it.
Honestly, I can really relate to that case. But still, why do so many founders build things no one wants?
Because they begin by trying to think of startup ideas. That is doubly dangerous. It doesn't merely yield a few good ideas. It yields bad ideas that sound plausible enough to fool you into working on them. At YC, we call these made-up or sitcom startup ideas. Imagine one of the characters on a TV show was starting a startup. The writers would have to invent something for it to do. But coming up with good startup ideas is hard. It's not something you can do for the asking. So, unless they got amazingly lucky, the writers would come up with an idea that sounded plausible, but was actually bad. For example, a social network for pet owners. It doesn't sound obviously mistaken. Millions of people have pets. Often they care a lot about their pets and spend a lot of money on them. Surely many of these people would like a site where they could talk to other pet owners. Not all of them, perhaps. But if just 2 or 3% were regular visitors, you could have millions of users. You could serve them targeted offers and maybe charge for premium features. The danger of an idea like this is that when you run it by your friends with pets, they don't say, I would never use this. They say, yeah, maybe I could see using something like that. Even when the startup launches, it will sound plausible to a lot of people. They don't want to use it themselves, at least not right now, but they could imagine other people wanting it. Sum that reaction across the entire population, and you have 0 users.
Exactly. Actually, there is this book called The Mom Test, which basically teaches how to ask correct questions to the correct people. The main idea is that you shouldn't ask your mom whether your business is a good idea because she loves you and will lie to you. So yeah, now as we identified the problem, Paul, what do we do then? How do we start a startup?
Well, first of all, starting a startup is not easy at all. However, one of the most common types of advice we give at Y Combinator is to do things that don't scale. A lot of would-be founders believe that startups either take off or don't. You build something, make it available, and if you've made a better mousetrap, people beat a path to your door as promised, or they don't, in which case the market must not exist. Actually, startups take off because the founders make them take off. There may be a handful that just grew by themselves, but usually it takes some sort of push to get them going. A good metaphor would be the cranks that car engines had before they got electric starters. Once the engine was going, it would keep going, but there was a separate and laborious process to get it going.
Interesting. Does it apply to getting initial users?
Exactly. The most common unscalable thing founders have to do at the start is to recruit users manually. Nearly all startups have to. You can't wait for users to come to you. You have to go out and get them. Stripe is one of the most successful startups we've funded, and the problem they solved was an urgent one. If anyone could have sat back and waited for users, it was Stripe. But in fact, they're famous within YC for aggressive early user acquisition.
What do you mean by aggressive early user acquisition?
Okay, let me frame it this way. Startups building things for other startups have a big pool of potential users in the other companies we've funded, and none took better advantage of it than Stripe. At YC, we use the term Collison installation for the technique they invented. More diffident founders ask, will you try our beta? And if the answer is yes, they say, great, we'll send you a link. But the Collison brothers weren't going to wait. When anyone agreed to try Stripe, they'd say, right then, give me your laptop, and set them up on the spot.
Stripe is definitely an exceptional case, I'd say. In reality, there are a lot of founders who avoid recruiting users manually. Do you have any specific explanation for that?
There are two reasons founders resist going out and recruiting users individually. One is a combination of shyness and laziness. They'd rather sit at home writing code than go out and talk to a bunch of strangers and probably be rejected by most of them. But for a startup to succeed, at least one founder, usually the CEO, will have to spend a lot of time on sales and marketing. The other reason founders ignore this path is that the absolute numbers seem so small at first. This can't be how the big, famous startups got started, they think. The mistake they make is to underestimate the power of compound growth. You'll be doing different things when you're acquiring users 1,000 at a time. And growth has to slow down eventually. But if the market exists, you can usually start by recruiting users manually and then gradually switch to less manual methods.
Can you be more specific, Paul? Maybe can you share a particular startup example here?
Sure, Airbnb is a classic example of this technique. Marketplaces are so hard to get rolling that you should expect to take heroic measures at first. In Airbnb's case, these consisted of going door to door in New York, recruiting new users and helping existing ones improve their listings. Airbnb now seems like an unstoppable juggernaut. But early on it was so fragile that about 30 days of going out and engaging in person with users made the difference between success and failure.
You mentioned Airbnb was super fragile early on. Can you talk a bit more about the early stages of startups?
Sure, the question to ask about an early stage startup is not, is this company taking over the world? But how big could this company get if the founders did the right things? And the right things often seem both laborious and inconsequential at the time. Microsoft can't have seemed very impressive when it was just a couple of guys in Albuquerque writing basic interpreters for a market of a few thousand hobbyists, as they were then called. But in retrospect, that was the optimal path to dominating microcomputer software. And I know Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia didn't feel like they were en route to the big time as they were taking professional photos of their first host's apartments. They were just trying to survive. But in retrospect, that too was the optimal path to dominating a big market.
And still, after all this conversation, it's really hard for me to understand how to find and recruit users manually. How should founders do that?
If you build something to solve your own problems, then you only have to find your peers, which is usually straightforward. Otherwise, you'll have to make a more deliberate effort to locate the most promising vein of users. The usual way to do that is to get some initial set of users by doing a comparatively untargeted launch, and then to observe which kind seem most enthusiastic and seek out more like them. For example, Ben Silbermann noticed that a lot of the earliest Pinterest users were interested in design. So he went to a conference of design bloggers to recruit users, and that worked well.
Heck yeah, Paul. I guess that was it. I truly had a blast talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. It was amazing. I really hope to meet you in person one day.
Thanks, Archill. It was my pleasure to be here. Just to remind our listeners, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about this YouTube channel. Thanks again. See you.